Thank you for your consent to give an interview to Strati, the Baku-based Institute for Strategic Analysis, and for its presenter, Fuad Mukhtarli, which presents Global Corners. I would like very briefly to inform our readers and viewers about you, Paul Goble, who is specialist on ethnic and religious issues in Eurasia, currently prepares daily reports on developments in the region for his blog Window on Eurasia to blogspot.com. Paul Goble also worked um, earlier for the CIA, the Foreign Broadcast Information Service, for as special assistant for Soviet nationalities and special advisor for Soviet nationality and Baltic affairs at the US Department of State, director of research and director of communications and technology at Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. That's very briefly about you, who is very well known and very often quoted when it comes about the ways of the Karabakh conflict. But today, I would like to ask you, as I've been doing it since March, when the COVID-19 pandemic outbroke, I'd like to ask your opinion about the coronavirus. And different experts come up with different views and visions. They say the world will not be as it was before the pandemic. And our viewers and our readers would like to hear your views as a man who have seen lots of during his lifetime. Please.
Us back to greater cooperation than many expect. Um, some have said, and I think wisely, that the coronavirus pandemic is not going to so much give a new direction to developments in the world, but rather exacerbate the developments that were already going on. On the one hand, some countries will undoubtedly use it as an excuse to try to isolate themselves from the rest of the world, while others will see the need to have greater cooperation because isolation will simply open the way to new pandemics. We are living in one way, we are living in a new world, and that is this. It is now possible to get from any point on the earth to any other point in 24 hours or less.
Yeah.
What that means is that the old world, which we assumed there were issues that could take place somewhere else and wouldn't affect us, is gone. The big thing about this pandemic, the big thing that I think we have to keep in mind, is that if you look at all the earlier pandemics of the last, say, 20 to 40 years, all of them hit the poorer countries of the world. They hit in Africa, they hit in Asia. This one has hit the wealthier countries. And of course, that means that the wealthier countries think it's more important. But it also means that the self-confidence the international community had that epidemiology was something you worried about in Africa or South Asia is gone. That confidence is gone. We're never going to go back to a certainty or to a sense that we can avoid all the problems that wherever they are, they can spread and they will spread. It's not possible to block everything, and living with that new reality is going to be hard. But I think it's rather dangerous to predict that the world will be completely different, as some people are doing, because my sense is so many things will not change, and that many things that had been changing, people will see pushed in a different direction precisely because they will have to cooperate in order to prevent future pandemics.
Okay. Okay, let me go now to my traditional question. That is the Karabakh conflict, in which you are very often quoted by expert community in this part of the world. And the Karabakh conflict has remained unresolved for over 30 years now. And very often we call it the sword of Damocles over Azerbaijan and Armenia throughout their independence. And when we look back and when we look forward, I can confidently say that no one sees light at the end of the tunnel. It would be very good, very positive and beneficial for our viewers and readers, again, to find out your opinion about this conflict and what would you suggest to the warring parties. How should they approach the conflict after 30 years, or who knows what? The floor is yours, man.
Well, I'm happy to speak to that. I probably will die only being remembered for having proposed a territorial swap as a solution almost 30 years ago. Borders get changed, and I think the question is, how do you allow for that without creating new problems? There are three realities that I think need to be kept in mind. First, both Azerbaijan and Armenia will benefit from a solution. That if this conflict goes away, both countries will be able to focus on domestic issues. Both countries will have far better transit and therefore more trade. Both countries will be able to achieve a great deal more in the future. So that's the first principle. The second principle is that we are dealing with a situation, as we often do, when each side is attached to a different basic idea or basic principle. Azerbaijan takes the position that territorial integrity must be restored, that Karabakh is part of Azerbaijan because it was part of Azerbaijan. Armenia takes the view that the principle of national self-determination is more important, and therefore, since there are many Armenians in Karabakh, if they want to become an independent country or to become part of Armenia, that must take precedence. You have to admit that these are two points of view that it's not very easy to square the circle. There are options that people come up with. The Åland Islands arrangement that the League of Nations used between Sweden and Finland, but those were islands. And there weren't massive refugee flows and 30 years of deaths as we have here. The third, I think, factor that needs to be remembered is that I believe this conflict can only be solved, will only be solved, when the leadership of Azerbaijan and the leadership of Armenia speak to one another. That waiting for some outside force, be it the West or be it Russia, to come in and impose a settlement simply won't work. Any settlement that would be imposed from the outside by the use of economic measures or military ones would simply leave the other side feeling that it had been betrayed and that you might get an armistice, but you wouldn't get a peace. The basis of my argument years ago, which is probably overtaken by events, but the basis was if you want a peace and not just an armistice. In other words, you want a peace so that both sides can proceed without the sense that the other got more than it should, or that they got less, it got less than it should. You have to come up with some arrangement so that each side walks away with something it wants. How do you do that? Well, if you start with two antithetical principles, that's not easy. But there are possibilities, and I still think, that there is a possibility for talking between Baku and Yerevan that open the way to a kind of some territorial adjustments or swaps, if you will, that would potentially, at least, allow each side to walk away with a sense that it got something and didn't just lose something. I think that unless you have an agreement in which each side feels that it got something and didn't just lose something, you will never have a peace. What you will have at best is an armistice, and that armistice will break down because there will be violations. Now, is that going to be possible anytime soon? It won't be possible as long as it's in the interest of some outside powers to exploit the tension in order to give them a greater role. And it will not be possible if the two governments involved make use of this issue as a political weapon domestically to justify whatever they want to justify. Getting beyond that will be hard. It's not impossible. My guess is that this is a generational issue, that the people whose mindset was formed by the events of the tragic events, let's be clear, the tragic events of the late 80s and early 90s, that generation will have to be supplanted by another generation that decides that there are other things that are more important than simply remembering 1989 or 1991 or 1994. And I think that the fact that the presidents of Azerbaijan and Armenia came so close 20 years ago in Key West to some kind of an agreement like that means that it can happen. But it's going to happen because people in the government of Azerbaijan and people in the government of Armenia recognize that this is not in their interest to have it continue. Outside third parties, the Russians, the Americans, the Europeans, the Iranians, can all play a role in helping to make that easier, at least potentially. But they cannot drive the process. The process has to come out of Baku and Yerevan. And I think that's probably going to take the rise of a new generation of people in both places. I very much think that we will eventually see a settlement. I also believe pretty much that settlement will involve, in part, some territorial shifts. I really believe that. I think and I also believe that changing territory is much better than moving people against their will. That forcible, the people who say, well, we have a situation now, we just simply move people. Well, moving people is a much more dangerous and much more problematic issue, and it tends to lead to memories which drive political views for many, many decades. We've seen that in India and Pakistan. They're not willing to forget what happened in 1947, and I think that we have to hope that there will be creative people in both Baku and Yerevan who will be prepared to think about, who will recognize that a solution to this, one way or another, is more important than to insist on one's own position to the exclusion of anything else, because that will not get us to peace. That will simply get us, at best, to an armistice, and there will be a new war within years or at least decades.
Yeah, good. Well, let me ask you about the role of OSCE Minsk Group co-chairs. That is Russia, and precisely I would like to focus on Russia's alleged role in this part of the world. I mean, both in Armenia and in Azerbaijan. The overall view is that the Kremlin, for obvious historical, geographical, and dozens of other reasons, has been playing or should play a crucial role in the resolution of the conflict, but it pursues own goal and instead hampers a fair solution. And we have a saying in Azerbaijan, especially in media circles, who are very keen on this problem and very often discuss, they say the key to the conflict remains in the corridors of the Kremlin. And given different views, what would you say on this issue? What would you advise those who stick to that opinion? Can the Kremlin play a really crucial role to this end?
Well, I think I have two broad observations about that. The first is that it's not just been 30 years since the worst part of the Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict emerged. It's been 30 years since Azerbaijan and Armenia became independent countries. Yeah. And the idea that nothing can happen unless the former imperial center decides to make it happen is to live in the past. I think Moscow, in fact, matters less today than at any time since the end of the Soviet Union. And I think that the extent to which, excuse me, that Russian policy has alienated its neighbors means that it isn't going to be the player that some people hope for. I fear that waiting for Moscow is an excuse not to think creatively oneself about what Azerbaijan or Armenia can do. That's the first point. The second point is to remember this. Moscow drew the lines in the Caucasus with specific intentions. It kept Azerbaijan from having a contiguous border with Nakhchivan because it didn't want Turkey to be able to have a direct land route to Baku and then to Central Asia. It created Karabakh in an asymmetric way as a Armenian majority area, but within Azerbaijan and subordinate to Azerbaijan, guaranteeing that it would be a permanent irritant. The Russian government, that is in its guise as the Soviet government, created this problem. Yeah. The borders that were drawn in the 1920s by Stalin are why we have this war and why we have no settlement now. I believe they were drawn because Moscow believed, and I think it still believes, that tensions between Armenia and Azerbaijan are the best way to maintain Russian influence in the region. I think that as long as Armenia and Azerbaijan are at daggers drawn, Russia believes that it will be the overwhelming paramount power, if you will, in the region, and that tension works to Russia's advantage. It is simply not true that everyone wants a solution to problems. many problems are work to the benefit of someone. You would create a problem because it helps you, and you don't want a settlement because if it were solved, if there were peace tomorrow, if you imagine a situation in which Armenia and Azerbaijan could have a peace settlement, regardless of how we think that we think that would look like, okay?
Yeah.
If that happened, I promise you that we would see efforts made by Moscow via its use of the Lezgin minority, via its use of the issue of Azerbaijanis in Dagestan to destabilize the situation. And I also believe that we would see efforts by Moscow to create problems in southern Azerbaijan so as to create a situation in which those tensions that would have been resolved by this agreement, that we aren't going to say what it looks like, um, would end, that it would collapse. Because as long as there is tension, Moscow benefits. I have to tell you, I thought it was a mistake 30 years ago to create the Minsk group. I thought that that was not the way to address this problem. I thought it would be valuable for various countries to use their good offices to encourage Armenia and Azerbaijan to speak with one another. I still believe that. I think the solution, if one is going to be found, is going to be found in those talks by creative people from both Baku and Yerevan, and that waiting for someone outside to solve it. The international community is in general on the side of Azerbaijan with respect to the principle of territorial integrity, because the United Nations, in fact, is the United States. It would have been called the United States, except there's another entity, the United States of America, which is called the United States. It is not a representation of nations, it is a representative of states. And so the international community tilts in that direction. On the other hand, the international community has watched since the UN was established in 1945 that the number of countries in the world has increased from 55 to over 200. And most of that increase came because peoples, nations, gained the possibility of being states on the principle of national self-determination. So the principle is very much there, but to expect either the West or Russia to come up with a solution, I think, is avoiding the responsibility that must lie in Baku and Yerevan. As I say, I believe, because I was very encouraged by how close things came when former President Aliyev spoke with his Armenian counterpart in Key West. They came very, very close to an agreement. We forget that. We tend to act as if nothing could happen. Now, it didn't work, but that doesn't mean it can't work. And I believe that clever people in Baku and clever people in Armenia can find a way to engage in confidence building and ultimately to resolve this. But the solution has got to come first and foremost from Baku and Yerevan. And outside players need to be kept out mostly because one outside player has a very negative role, has played a very negative role in this region for 100 years, and the other outside players either don't have the resources or don't have the focus that would allow them to do it. Then if we have a situation where the leader of my country needs to be reminded that Finland isn't part of the Russian Federation. In that situation, how does one expect the contribution to come from us? I believe, and I'm convinced, having met many very smart Azerbaijanis in particular, that there is the capacity in Baku to come up with something. Can it happen anytime soon? Will it happen overnight? No. It's going to take a long time. But if people in Baku and if people in Yerevan start saying, this is a problem that we have to solve rather than waiting for somebody outside, be it Moscow or Washington, to come in and solve, then
Okay.
I think there can be progress.
Yeah. Well, let me re-ask, by saying people in Baku and in Yerevan must come out and say we have to resolve the conflict, do you believe those who are in power, the governments, or you mean general public?
Obviously, agreements between states take place between governments.
Yeah.
Having said that, it is terribly important to understand the role of people, intellectuals, experts, cultural figures, who often can be the beginning of a new relationship. I'm a great believer that seeing Azerbaijani intellectuals meet with Armenian intellectuals and vice versa is the kind of confidence building mechanism that can provide the basis. They're not going to make the decisions. They're not going to put the solution down. But if people have had that experience, I mean, we, the United States and the Soviet Union, for several decades, had the Pugwash Conference, where experts on the American side and experts on the Soviet side met together. The academic exchanges, which began in the late 50s, played a profound role in changing the relationship and ultimately the policies of both Moscow and Washington during the Cold War. These are, one can say that it took a very long time and it should have happened sooner, but some conflicts are difficult enough that they're not going to be solved overnight. I believe that the Armenian Azerbaijan one is in such a category, but that doesn't mean that you can't work toward it. The key thing is not to expect somebody else to solve it and to try to be as creative as one can, including using intellectuals, populations, whatever. I would like to see a future in which Azerbaijanis who were driven from their homes by this war were able to go home. I would like to see a future in which Armenians would feel safe. I would like to see a future in which we don't read on a weekly basis the losses of people shooting at each other across a border. I believe that's all possible, but I also believe that it will take many, many steps. It will not be any quick fix. I regret mightily that there wasn't more effort made when things were more fluid in 91 and 92. I believe that the ideas that I was talking about in January of 92 were really possible then, that there was a sense of fluidity, that there was a possibility that things that no one had done could happen. The longer this goes on, the less willingness there will be to recognize that there are such possibilities. That doesn't mean they can't exist. It just means that it'll be a bit harder to find them.
Yeah. Okay. The view right now is that neither Azerbaijan nor Armenia is willing to take any step, absolutely no step, to sit at the table, to negotiate. Even the feeling is that they don't want to try. And the only rhetoric we hear every day, almost on daily basis from both sides, is the reference to military solution. For example, you remember 2016 flare-up in the Karabakh, and
Right.
later the Azerbaijani army took control of several heights in Nakhchivan, and
Right.
now the government says all roads leading to Karabakh from Armenia is under control of the Azerbaijani army. And right now, the Armenian government is making the third road from Armenia to Nagorno-Karabakh along the river Aras, which again exacerbate the situation, and everyone on both sides, I think, believe that there's no point, given no superpowers makes effort to press on Armenia to make concessions, and the only way is to build up militarily and go to war. Now my question is, does Armenia, or is Armenia so confident that it will keep the occupied territories under its own control for forever, that it endeavors to build another road which costs huge amount of money, given the poor state of Armenian economy, plus pandemic, which takes so many resources from the government? What would you say about it, please?
Well, I think the first thing to understand, and it is certainly what I would say to an Armenian audience, is that if this conflict is defined as having only a military solution, Armenia will ultimately lose. There's no question about that. For the time being, the Russians are still prepared to back Armenia no matter what, but that will not always be true. I treasure the observation of one of your countrymen who famously said that in the South Caucasus, Armenia is the way, Georgia is Georgia is the way, Armenia is the tool, and Azerbaijan is the prize. That Russia will shift sides in this conflict in an instant if Moscow believes that it can have effective control in Azerbaijan. This is simply the way it is. Armenia cannot count on having outside support, and it does not have the resources or the population in the long term to win if this is defined only in a military way. That's just the first thing that Azerbaijan needs, or that Armenians need to understand, and I'm sure that people in Azerbaijan know. Okay?
Yeah.
At the same time, because of Moscow's willingness to support the Armenians fairly uncritically, no matter what, Azerbaijan can't exercise a military option without having negative consequences for itself. And Azerbaijan suffers, as does Armenia, from the reduction in the amount of trade that is possible because of a continued military problem. I think one of the saddest pictures I've ever seen is the railroads that head west from Baku and stop because the conflict means there's nowhere for them to go. That's a tragedy. We all know that Azerbaijan would have done better with any conceivable peace. Okay, that's the other side of this equation. Now, that doesn't mean that Azerbaijan should give up everything it wants, and it doesn't mean that Armenia should alternatively give up everything it wants. It just means that you have to start with where people really are, rather than waiting for some outsider to solve things. And I'm quite confident that there are people who can talk to one another, and that over time people will recognize that one needs some kind of arrangement so that Armenians can feel secure, Azerbaijan can be comfortable with its borders, so that access to Nakhchivan is guaranteed, and not having to go through the case. If you want to make a broader argument, and this gets beyond what we're talking about right now, but the tragedy of the South Caucasus is that Azerbaijan's elite and Azerbaijan's thinking comes more from Nakhchivan than it does from Azerbaijan proper, and Armenia's thinking and Armenia's leaders come more from Karabakh than they do from Armenia. The basic principle of understanding the rise of nationalism is that nationalism happens in marginal places. You don't become a nationalist because you live in the middle of a place. It's because you live on the edge. And that is a fundamental tragedy. One of the things that led me to write the infamous Goble Plan was a desire to have a situation in which the core of Armenia and the core of Azerbaijan would define the governments and the policies of those two countries, rather than allowing people at the margins. It is no accident that Hitler came out of Austria. It is no accident that Zhirinovsky came out of Kazakhstan. It is something that we have to deal with. And if you want to get, very long term, that needs to be addressed. I think that what's interesting is both Armenia and Azerbaijan benefit if that's addressed, because the core of Armenia benefits if it's not driven by this fifth wheel, if you will, called Karabakh, and Azerbaijan certainly benefits if the future of that country is defined by the much larger population on the Afsharan Peninsula than it is by the relatively small number of people in Nakhchivan. It's just simply, this is something that I don't think people understand. I don't think that when people in Armenia, when you tell them, they recognize that it's true, but it is not something that people in Armenia or Azerbaijan are saying very publicly, because the powers that be right now come from those two places whose importance one over time has to see decline if one is going to get a settlement and a peace. That's just going to be required.
Yeah, but that was what you said about elite coming from Nakhchivan in Azerbaijan and from Karabakh in Armenia. But the situation right now in both countries has changed. I would say even in Armenia, now the new man, Prime Minister Pashinyan, has nothing to do with Karabakh, but he turned out to be more categorical than Kocharian or Saksyan used to be, and in Azerbaijan also the elite or members of elite are changing right now. But I would like you to take into consideration the recent statements. I mean, since 2018, when Pashinyan came to power, and the current situation, which is now Armenia seems in the grip of domestic protest. I wouldn't say unrest so far. 2 days ago, the parliament stripped one of the wealthiest men of Armenia from his parliamentary mandate. I mean, Tsarukyan. He's facing prison, maybe prison. At the same time, one of those Armenian presidents who hailed from Karabakh, Robert Kocharian, was bailed out for $4 million yesterday. Given all these developments, will Pashinyan stay in power? Second, my opinion is that both people from Kacharyan's circle, from Saksyan's circle, as well as those who support Sarkyan are going, and of course others, are going to unite against Pashinyan. And if this happens, which seems is in the pipeline, the situation will come out of control in Armenia and will make the current prime minister quit his post.
Well, I think that to understand what's going on, Pashinyan's deference to the Karabakh faction, if you will, reflected his own political weakness. Yes, he had support in Yerevan, but not a lot of support from the rest of the country. By appearing to take a hard line on Karabakh, he was able to get some support. But that wasn't ultimately sustainable, and there are forces, including Moscow, who are very interested in bringing down Pashinyan. I actually believe that if Pashinyan and President Liv got together in the same room for some period of time, that Pashinyan would be far more capable of talking about moving in a positive direction than most of his predecessors have been for the last 20 years. I think in the 90s it was different. I think we have to make a distinction between the first decade and the last two. Having said that, yes, I mean, the chaos in Armenia is something that is really worrisome, because people in Yerevan might try to solve the situation by taking actions in a good little war, as it were. They will lose, but it would be the kind of thing where you would mobilize the population in order to support, in order to come to power and stay in power. Now, I very much hope that the wiser and cooler heads in Baku understand that the worst thing Azerbaijan can do for its own interest is to help Armenia, to help an Armenian government solidify itself by playing up a war scare. You don't want to do that. You rather want Armenia to have to confront the reality that Armenia can't win this war. It simply can't. And if it goes to a military operation, Azerbaijan will win. On the other hand, Azerbaijan will not be able to get a peace. Azerbaijan will get an armistice, and an armistice won't last. It's easy to often to defeat another side militarily. It's much more difficult to get an agreement worked out. My country is right now suffering from the fact that in 1865, the North defeated the South, but it did not get a peace. In effect, it got an armistice, that the North thought the South had surrendered on the basis of its entire social and political system, when in fact what happened was the South, many in the South believed that they had lost this round, but they would, as they would say, the South will rise again. And we are still living with that division within the United States. So what we have to do is to figure out ways to move beyond that. We're struggling right now as a country to do that. It isn't going to be easy. I'm suggesting this is almost a universal human problem. But I also believe that clever people sitting and thinking hard can come up with ideas. I I remain attached because I came up with it so long ago to some territorial adjustments that would, I believe, meet the needs of both sides. But that's not the only way to do these things. There are others. There are regional economic arrangements. There are people-to-people activities. Um, but they're going to have to come out of Baku and they're going to have to come out of Yerevan, and they're not going to come, to be blunt, in a positive way from Moscow or even from the West, as much as people in the West would like to have a solution.
Yeah. Um, Iran is often criticized in the Azerbaijani media and by general public because of its alleged full support to Armenia. And the overall view is that without Iran's support, Armenia wouldn't overcome its huge problems, especially some 10, 15 years ago when it was in the grip of, it had fuel, gas, and so many related problems. What can you say about Iran's role? Of course, Iran is not playing a positive role for the resolution of the Karabakh conflict, but has Tehran's role been crucial for Armenia's avoidance to come to agreement with Azerbaijan over the problem, over the Karabakh problem?
Well, Iran is a way out for Armenia. It's a trading route. It's a place that Armenia can go without having to make kinds of compromises that it doesn't want to make or can't make. Look at the map. I still believe that Moscow is much more important than Tehran for what Armenia is doing. I believe that Armenia remains trapped in a Soviet mindset far more than it does a broader geopolitical one. That's what I'm convinced of. Having said that, Tehran has very definite views on how it views Azerbaijan and how it views Armenia. Armenians have historically played a huge role in Iranian life in the capital, in Tehran. Azerbaijan, on the other hand, has a large portion south of the Araks, called normally southern Azerbaijan, which the Iranians are terrified might lead to the breakdown of the Iranian state. In that situation, one can't expect Iran to be an equal opportunity player. It's simply not going, that's not on. On the other hand, to the extent that Iran can back away from its Persian nationalism, which has informed the regime of the Ayatollahs every bit as much as it informed the Shahs, and allow Azerbaijani Turks in the south to use their language, to have cultural institutions, to be linked from Tabriz to Baku economically, and even, I think, bigger issues than that, then I think maybe Iran can be weaned away from the notion that it has no choice but to support Armenia as a way, on the principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Yeah.
I don't think that when Iranian leaders get up in the morning, they think, how can we support Armenia? I think they think, how can we have a lever on Baku and Armenia is a convenient lever. Iran doesn't have a lot of others, and so that I think Iran is driven not by being pro-Armenian, but by being anti-Azerbaijani, or at least fearful of Azerbaijan. I think the same thing is true of Moscow. I think Moscow is less pro-Armenian than a lot of Armenians think. I think that they view it as a lever, an effective lever, on the place they really care about in the Southern Caucasus. Azerbaijan is, from Moscow's point of view, the prize. From Iran's point of view, it's a threat. And that combination leads both of them to be in bed with the Armenians right now. It isn't, and this I want to stress, inevitable that will always be the case. I can construct a model of this region in which Tehran would see value in cooperating with Azerbaijan, and that would have to do with both naval and sea trade and seabed development and rail transit from Central Asia and China westward. And I think that I can imagine it deciding that that's more important, or even the north-south rail lines that Moscow would like to see. Armenia doesn't have the ability to offer Iran that. Azerbaijan does. Yeah. So if you play up one set of issues as opposed to others, you can get bigger geopolitical consequences. And I think that, again, clever people can sit and think and see how to do that. Is it all going to work? Is it going to create a new Jerusalem? No. It's going to take a long time. But I'm not as pessimistic as many people are. I think that what we should have learned from the last 50 years is that tomorrow will have many of the same elements of today, but they may be rearranged. I like the image of the kaleidoscope, the children's toy, which you turn and different pieces of glass, colored glass, come down in different patterns. The pieces don't change their shape, but the overall pattern can. And I think that the South Caucasus is exhibit A of the kaleidoscopic possibilities for the future.
Yeah. I can't but ask you a question about relations which doesn't exist almost between Armenia and Turkey. What do you think the Armenian government should do to get rid of some of its unfounded claims and gradually come to the terms that Turkey might be a window for Armenia to open up for the West? But hopes were high when Pashinyan came to power, especially with his pro-Western agenda. But more than 2 years have gone, but no moves have been made.
Well, I think one has to understand that Armenians, the key date in Armenian history is 1915. Whatever you want to call it, that's something that defines how Armenians view the world. That makes it very, very difficult for them to make the first steps to Turkey. It's just a reality. When I was growing up in the 1950s and 60s, there were many people in the United States who wouldn't buy Volkswagens because they were made in Germany, and we had fought a war against Germany. That's no longer true, but the war that we fought, World War II, cost Americans far less than it cost Armenians, both in total numbers and in percentage terms. Having said that, Armenia desperately needs to have multiple routes out. It will benefit from that. That's something that I think Armenians understand. It is not something that is easy to sell to the average Armenian in the street, not yet. But I think that again, this is one of those situations where over time people will change. I didn't expect. I was not as optimistic as many people that Pashinyan was going to open a new chapter in relations with Ankara. I thought that ultimately he didn't have the political clout at home to be able to do things like that. And I didn't think that he was going to be clever enough to try to use foreign policy to change the domestic agenda. Some leaders might have, he didn't. So I was not expecting this to happen. But I do believe that if you look at the last 30 years, the attitudes in Yerevan about Turkey have evolved, and they'll continue to evolve. Have they all moved in the same proper direction all the time? No. There's been progress and there's been pulling back. But the fact is, if Armenia is going to be a successful country, it's going to need transit out. It's going to need trading partners. It doesn't have to love those people. It doesn't have to forgive them for what happened 100 years ago. What it does have to do is to say, whatever happened, that's not going to define everything about our relationship. The United States deals with many countries that it has good reason not to get along with. We do so usually from a position of overwhelming power, but we have to learn how to get along with people we don't necessarily like, and so do the Armenians, and so do the Azerbaijanis. The notion that we're going to wake up sometime 100 years from now, and that Armenians, Turks, Iranians, and Azerbaijanis are all going to love one another and think they're the best possible people in the world is a beautiful vision, but I don't think it's a particularly realistic one. The possibility, however, that Turks, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, and Iranians may all find a way to cooperate, to build rail lines, to build shipping lines, to engage in trade, to cooperate when it benefits themselves, I think that's really possible. And I think that the two issues need to be separated as much as they can be. Is that going to be easy? No. Is it going to take a long time? Yes. But we'll never get there if we don't make the first steps.
Yeah. Okay. Let me take you to Georgia. The COVID-19 pandemic has slowed down developments inside the Georgian government, Georgian society. No more protests, but the problem remains there. The opposition has been calling for electoral reforms. When the protest broke out in Tbilisi several months ago, the government agreed to profoundly reform the electoral law, but later it made a step back. But now on the pages of on the media pages, on newspaper pages, the opposition has been again demanding change, again change. But Ivanishvili, on the other hand, is giving lots of promises. And this is one part of my question. But the second part is that the Ivanishvili, the billionaire who supports the governing party right now, is believed to be a man of Russia. But Russia doesn't openly want to improve relations, to take its support from Georgia's separatist regions. On the other hand, what it seems to me as an observer, Ivanishvili doesn't also support or doesn't enjoy support from Europe and from the US administration, unlike Saakashvili did several years ago.
Well, I think that Georgia is a political, long-running political soap opera. Whatever, if one looks at any one particular day, it's usually a disaster because you can point to so many people doing things that are not even in their own interests. Having said that, and recognizing that Georgia has a fundamental problem in that a good hunk of its territory, in its mind, is occupied by someone else, that its ability to have transit that works effectively and have economic development is very difficult, that Moscow is playing a less than positive role, backing now one side and now another, covertly as well as overtly, makes this very difficult. I would like to see Georgia, evolve. My guess is that we inevitably focus very much on the colorful personalities, be it Saakashvili or Ivanishvili or whomever, rather than on the fundamental interests. The personalities come and go. The fundamental issues tend to define what a country will do. And my sense is that we should avoid focusing too much on the particulars. I think it's a mistake. It was a mistake on the part of many Western countries to be so overwhelmingly pro Saakashvili. Saakashvili did some good things, but he did some other things that were not good. And I must say, whatever good he did in Georgia has been vitiated by what I consider to be an extraordinarily unfortunate set of actions in Ukraine. I think that's just, he's been wrong. He was wrong to go. He's wrong to go back. He's said and done things that are destabilizing and dangerous. I think it's a mistake to focus too much on one leader because it leads you to make mistakes about relations. My country has done it frequently. There were far too many people who for far too long assumed that Mikhail Gorbachev was a good guy no matter what. Well, maybe he was a good guy from 85 to 88, but he was definitely not a good guy in 90 and 91. The same thing happened with Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin was celebrated as somehow perfect. And then it became very obvious that he was not only not perfect, but he was quite bad. In 93 by shelling the parliament, in 94 by invading Chechnya, and so on. And in case anyone needs any evidence of just how bad he turned out to be, look at who he appointed to succeed him. So individuals matter, but I think it's a mistake for outside analysts to focus too much on the individual personalities. And it's more important to think about the broader substrate of interests and concerns. Those things will tend to become dominant over time, whatever an individual leader does or doesn't do at any particular moment.
Okay. Paul, you write amazing...
Excuse me.
Okay.
I'm going to have to go fairly soon because I have a dog that wants to be walked. I
Okay.
didn't know how long our conversation would be.
Last question. Can I? Or?
Surely.
Huh?
Yes.
Okay. Putin is going to hold military parade to mark 75th anniversary of the World War II. Why? What happened to him to make up his mind again and to decide to hold this parade given amid the pandemic?
I think Russia has a very sad history in the 20th century. There are so few things that the Soviets did that people can be proud of. About the only thing that everybody agrees on is that its defeat of Hitler was a great triumph for the Soviet people. And you get agreement on that from one end of the political spectrum to the other. Putin has played to that because that's what he believes. I mean, for him, everything else is justified. The World War II is the universal moral solvent that dissolves any responsibility for the crimes of Stalin, and therefore you play up the war. Putin had announced long ago that he was going to have this great celebration of the 75th anniversary. He won't be alive for the 100th. That's just not going to happen. So this is his last chance to celebrate a round anniversary. And he was going to do it no matter what. I also believe that the timing of the reschedule was driven by something else. I believe Putin believed that if he had a huge triumphant Victory Day celebration, that Russians would be in such an upbeat mood that a week later they would go to the polls and approve his referendum. I think those two things are related, even though it's not smart to have voting during a pandemic. Yeah. Unfortunately for Putin, things are not working out very well for this 75th anniversary. More than 30 Russian cities have now refused to have parades.
Yeah.
Moreover, the leaders who are coming to stand on the mausoleum with him are not the world leaders that he hoped for. They're dictators who are dependent on Moscow and are isolated from the rest of the world. So domestically and foreign policy, Putin isn't getting out of this what he hoped for. But he's driven by the sense that this is about the only thing that will unite all Russians for a moment. Unfortunately for him, the way this is being carried out is undercutting his message. And the fact that it's come out that 80 Russian soldiers who will be close to him in this parade are going to be put in quarantine for 2 weeks so that he won't be exposed doesn't do his reputation any good, and means that a parade he hoped for as a great trampoline to winning the referendum, in fact, becomes something else. It's going to make him look bad. He will still report winning the referendum, but the amount of falsification that will be required to do that has gone way up by events that he probably couldn't foresee.
Yeah. Paul, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. And have a nice day. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I hope we can talk again. I enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Goodbye.
Bye.